What is up, everybody? AP Sports Cards here. We're taking a break from getting stuffed into lockers or whatever other nerdly things that we normally do in our lives to take an academic approach to discussing wins above replacement. Yes, that's right. We are talking about everybody's favorite statistic, WAR, today. Um, I'm going to talk about why I think WAR is the best statistic we have for measuring baseball players, and we're going to break down how it's calculated. This is going to be part of a four-part series because WAR is a complicated statistic, and I know some of you are already rolling your eyes. It's going to take four parts to describe how you calculate a statistic. This tells me that this statistic is made up and bad, but this first video is going to explain why WAR is a useful statistic, mostly because WAR attempts to answer a very difficult question: which players provide the most value to their team? And we're going to get through why the fact that WAR even attempts to ask that question makes it an important statistic for us to use when evaluating baseball players, especially compared to other statistics. We're going to tackle some of the typical arguments against WAR, and this should be fun. Um, so before we get into it, we're gonna have a little play everybody's favorite game here, which is guess the player. So up here on the screen, you have two different stat lines. I tried to pull kind of mostly traditional stats here, and we're gonna try to figure out who we think had the better season in 2021. These are both hobby relevant players that played in 2021, the Major League Baseball season. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use this to illustrate why I think WAR is a useful stat and why even people who don't like WAR do something similar to what we do when we calculate WAR every time they look at a box score. So if you take a look at this these two players right here, player A and player B, it's really not about who was better. It's about our thought process as we try to figure out who is better. So I'm going to let you guys take a look at this. If I was looking at this, first thing I gravitate to would be the slash line because it's the closest thing I have to advanced metrics on this page. Slash line here, it looks like player A is a little better at making contact, whereas player B might have a little bit more power or at least a higher slugging percentage, but it's basically even on slugging. But I think, looking at this right off the bat, player A seems to be a bit ahead just because I really value that 390 on base percentage. As a stats guy, that's kind of where I would lean. Looking at the home runs, they look about even. RBIs, player A looks like he's ahead. Runs scored, player A looks to be ahead, and player B looks to be a little better athlete, but a little faster with the 25 stolen bases. So, if I'm comparing this all out, the counting stats are pretty similar. I'm going to go with player A just for his better on base percentage. But I could be convinced either way, right? And so what's interesting when you're making these comparisons, right? What did I just do in my head, right? I tried to weigh the fact that, player B has 25 steals. He has 21 extra steals compared to player A, whereas player A has a 390 on base percentage compared to player B's 364. So, I'm trying to balance whether I think that the additional 26 points of on base percentage is more or less valuable than the additional 21 steals that are coming from player B, right? And this is why we have wins above replacement. It's doing the same thing that we do mentally every time we look at stats. You don't even realize you're doing it when you're making this comparison, but you are making trade-offs. And you're assigning value to each stat individually and adding them up to figure out which player you think is the best. We're not looking at players here, so everything we're doing is based on stats. And if we're basing it on stats, what's to say that the traditional stats are any better than wins above replacement? So let's keep going. Give a little more information about these two players. Oh, well, this is interesting, right? We added a line here for games played. Player A has played 161 games last year, and player B played 130. So taking a look at this, I'm starting to value player A more, even more. So player B, it's actually really impressive that he was able to put up the counting stats that he put up in 130 games. But to me, getting that top line, slash line, batting average, on base percentage, slugging for an extra 31 games has a ton of value. And so if you're talking about who had a better regular season overall, it's player A. Now it's looking to me like player B is a better player when he's healthy. He can his counting stats keep up with player A, even when he played quite a bit fewer games. But the fact that player A played more games, if I was doing like MVP voting or anything like that, I'd say player A deserves to take it compared to player B here. So we're going to add some more information. We're going to add in defense to the picture. So when we take a look at defense, player A is an average first baseman and player B is a below average shortstop. So now this is getting interesting. I think that these two players are pretty close offensively when they play. Player B played 130 games and player A played 161. But player B played such a much more valuable position, right? There's a lot of guys who can play average first base. There's a lot fewer guys who can play below average shortstop. But now, you might be saying in your head, well, I'd rather have an average first baseman than a below average shortstop. See, that's on you to figure out. But what I want you to be thinking about while you're making those decisions is the fact that you are, averaging a bunch of statistics together to try to come up with one opinion, right? There was one of these two players was more valuable than the other in 2021. That's a fact. Now, the only thing is how good is our ability to measure that, right? There's no way these players provided exactly identical value to their team. So it's all about statistics' ability to measure this. And that's kind of bringing me to my main point of this video. Every statistic that exists, I like to think about it in two aspects. What question is it trying to answer, and how good of a job does it do at answering that question? And why I like wins above replacement is because it is the most ambitious and the most important with respect to what question it's trying to answer. So let's use an example. Let's take a look at a statistic like strikeouts. Strikeouts answers the question, how many times did you strike out? And if the answer is 110, the statistic strikeouts does a perfect job of answering that question. It measures exactly to 100% accuracy the number of times you struck out. So for a stat like strikeouts, I say that stat has 100% success at measuring something that's semi-important. Strikeouts are semi-important. So what question is wins above replacement? What question is WAR trying to answer? And the question is, how much value, stripping out all context, did this player provide to his team during the time period? And to me, that is just such a much more valuable question. That is the main question that you're trying to answer when you're looking at a baseball player. How good was this player and how much value did he provide to his team? So WAR isn't perfect in measuring that. There are multiple, and that's why, some of the main objections with WAR is I can't understand it. It's not perfect at measuring what it's trying to measure. There are two different types of WAR. How can this stat be a reasonable stat to use if even the industry itself can't agree on how it's calculated? And the reason, all of those things are true. WAR is not perfect, but what WAR does better than any other statistic is it asks the right question. Who is the better player? How valuable is this player? So yes, while WAR doesn't do a perfect job of measuring value, it's the only stat that even attempts to. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, and that's why I like to use WAR, right? And going with this, these player A and player B here, I think that there's you'll notice that when you're evaluating players, you're already doing that same thing. You have to answer the question, because I put it on the screen, you have to answer the question of who had a more valuable season. And in doing so, you're combining multiple statistics into one master statistic. And you're doing it kind of haphazardly if you're not using WAR, right? You are using your own intuition to figure out what you think is more valuable between an extra 21 steals versus an extra 30 points of on-base percentage. You use your own intuition to calculate that, which is fine. And, WAR tries to use mathematical models to calculate that. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind when we're bashing on WAR or when we're praising WAR. It's not perfect at measuring what it's trying to measure, but the thing it's trying to measure is the most valuable question that can be asked in a baseball, in the game of baseball. The other thing to keep in mind here, so I added a third player to this list, but this player is a pitcher, right? How on earth would you go about comparing the statistics you see for player C to the statistics you see for players A and B, right? That player C played in 100 less games. Then you're getting into innings pitched, K percentage, based on balls, ground ball percentage, ERA, and FIP. Let's look at player C real quick, right? This is the profile of a Cy Young level elite pitcher. 167 innings is not amazing, but it's solid. But that 37% Ks to 5% walks is outrageous. That means you're striking out more than a third of the batters you face, and you're very rarely walking people. You got a good ground ball percentage and a good ERA. The bottom number there is FIP, which is fielding independent pitching, which takes a combination of K percentage, base on ball percentage, and some other things, and calculates what your ERA should have been, assuming that you had an average defense, average batted ball profile against you, things like that. So that 2.43 ERA is really low, and according to FIP, it could have potentially been even lower if this person didn't get unlucky. So now that we explained the pitcher in this argument, how would you go about comparing the pitcher to the shortstop? You're really just kind of using your own intuition. Do I think that a position player with 42 home runs is better than the best pitcher in the game, and or the best pitcher in that season? Because player C looks like a typical like best pitcher of the season stat line here. So you can make that comparison. You could judge for yourself. You could say, well, I like the everyday player because, I want somebody who can affect all 162 games, or at least the 130 that they played in. But somebody else might say, well, I like the pitcher because in the 30 games that pitcher is actually going to pitch, he's controlling half the game. He's like basically the entire, defensive side of the ball. So it's a really tough question to answer, and WAR at least attempts to answer it. And the reason WAR's not perfect is because that question's freaking hard. That's a hard-ass question to answer. So, we just kind of keep that in mind. We're going to get the big reveal here, right? So these three players are Vladdy Jr., Fernando Tatis Jr., and Corbin Burnes last year. And here are the respective WARs. So the best player here kind of by, the best player in the 2021 season, I think, was Fernando Tatis Jr. He had 6.1 wins in only 130 games, which is amazing. But if you're talking about who provided the most value to their team, it's either Corbin Burnes or Vladdy. And WAR's not perfect, so I would probably take Vladdy in a future season because I think Corbin Burnes maybe played above his head last year. But if you're asking me who had a better year in 2021, I would say Corbin Burnes did. Based on that 7.5 WAR that he accrued over the year. But yeah, so this is what I'm trying to say here is that WAR is a great stat, not because it's perfect at measuring what it's trying to measure, but because what it's trying to measure is the most valuable question that could be asked. It's a very ambitious statistic. So next time you're hearing an objection about WAR, keep that in mind. Keep in mind that if you're not going to use WAR, you're using some method to determine how all of these stats add up, and you are mentally in your head adding up a player's offensive value, a player's defensive value, and a player's base running value, right, if it's a hitter. And then if it's a pitcher, you're adding up his pitching value from the amount of walks, strikeouts, singles, doubles, triples, home runs that he allows. You're adding all of that up mentally, and you are assigning value to it. So the only thing that WAR does that that you're not doing is it mathematically models how to assign that value. But it's not like WAR is some newfangled, fancy concept. It's just the same thing we've been doing for 200 years. We look at numbers, and we 200 years. Baseball's not that old. We look at numbers, we combine them together, and we intuit which combination of numbers we think is good. Because I don't believe you if you tell me you watch all of the games and scout these players. You might watch some of the games, you might watch a lot of the games, but I know that you're using statistics to make your evaluations. The biggest objection to WAR that I hate is when somebody says, I don't like WAR, I like using the eye test. And then you say, okay, what do you like about this player's swing? What do you like about this player's, athletic ability? And the first thing they do is they start talking about how many RBIs the guy has, or how many stolen bases. I'm like, okay, so you're not using the eye test. You're using statistics. You're just using worse statistics, or not even worse statistics. You're using statistics that you understand that can perfectly measure something, but these aren't statistics that are answering the question that you want to answer, which is who is the most valuable player in the league. So this is the first part of a 4-part series. So part 1 is basically, why do I like WAR? Why do we use WAR? And what is it good for, so to speak? Part 2 is going to be how we calculate the offensive components of WAR. Part 3 is going to be how we calculate the defensive components of WAR. And part 4 is going to be how we calculate the pitching components of WAR. So I'm going to flash on the screen here the equation for wins above replacement, and it's going to look intimidating. But if you really break down that equation, all it really is a player's offensive value, a player's defensive value, a player's base running value, and and then for pitchers, it's pitching value. There's also a component in there called replacement level, which we will learn about. But essentially, all that is how many offensive runs above average are you? How many defensive runs above average are you? Let's add them up. And then the only reason we have something called replacement level is because being average has value as well. So if you had average equals 0, if an average player was 0 WAR, then it would look like an average player is worthless, which would mean half of the players in the league are contributing negative value. That's not true. So what replacement level does is it makes it so that an average player is actually valuable, and 0 is no longer referenced to average. 0 is referenced to a random minor leaguer that you could pick up out of the minors and just assign to your team any day. So that's the equation for wins above replacement. I think that we'll get through each individual piece of this. We're going to have a nice little 4-part series. I hope some of you stick with me and watch it. I find this stuff endlessly entertaining, and I think a lot of people will want to learn about, how statistics are used in baseball and other sports too. So I'm really going to try hard to start digging into some of the more mathematical, analytical sides of these sports themselves, and then try to reference it to sports cards. Now, do I think that sports cards values of individual players will track perfectly with WAR? No, I do not. But I do think that over the years, more and more people are going to understand WAR and value it. And so maybe there's a buying opportunity for guys that have high WAR but low hobby appeal today. Because in 50 years, we're not going to remember enough. None of the collectors 50 years from now are going to have seen these guys play. They're all going to be these young kids who've never seen these guys play. So the only things that they'll have to look back on are statistics and videos, right? And the videos will definitely be valuable, but I think a lot of people are going to turn to statistics, and I think the statistic of choice is going to be wins above replacement, or whatever the 2060 equivalent of wins above replacement is. So yeah, from a sports cards perspective, I think that WAR is going to matter. I think that the fact that WAR is kind of undervalued in the hobby right now, to me, represents a buying opportunity. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this. Thank you for tuning in. We'll get back to you with part 2 soon, and have a great day.